Hello, Royal History Geeks. It's Gareth here, back after quite some time in terms of videos. I think this is actually the first video for about 3 years. What can I say? I've been busy. You'll be shocked to hear this, but making these videos and writing blog posts on royal history doesn't actually make my living, so I have to have a day job. Nonetheless, I'm back now. We are in COVID season, coronavirus. If you are watching this in years to come, we're in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic 2020. As I speak, I say the middle, could actually be the beginning. We don't know how long it's going to go on, but fingers crossed, we're in the middle or toward the end. Anyway, I have been doing a series looking at Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, and some of the key relationships in her life, which has been really good fun. Lots of engagement, lots of views. Thank you very much for that. This is the last one in the series, and it is on the relationship between Margaret Beaufort and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York. This relationship is probably the one that most people are likely to have a particularly strong opinion on, and opinion is pretty divided on it. Part of the reason for such a divided series of opinions is this book here, The White Princess by Philippa Gregory, which is a novel, historical fiction, which is effectively looking at the reign of Henry VII through the eyes of Elizabeth of York. It's a very good book. I enjoy it thoroughly, and it is historically accurate in the sense that the broad chronology of events is right. Everything that she says is based on something, which for historical fiction is all it needs to be. It doesn't need to be true, but I don't agree with much of the interpretation of crucial characters. That book then went on to be made into a short TV series called also The White Princess. I suspect most of you have watched it. You probably would have watched it if you were watching this video. And it's also good. It's good fun, but historically it's just whew. The book, broadly, don't agree with it all, but the right chronology. This is just out the window, the TV show. Richard thought, I can't watch this. I've heard about some of the things it's going to do, and I just cannot watch it. I'm like, well, I watch like Avengers or Star Trek, and I sound really cool, don't I? But anyway, yes, you're shocked to hear I am a geek. So I watch Avengers, I watch Star Trek. I know that's not true, so I'm watching those things and knowing they're not true. I'm just gonna watch The White Princess knowing it's not true and basically treat it like I would treat science fiction and not pretend that it's in any way based on history. So it's good fun. History, pretty bad. So, nonetheless, I think as a result, it's entered the popular consciousness that Elizabeth of York had a very bad relationship with Margaret Beaufort. And to be fair, I think this has been around a long time. I remember watching David Starkey's Monarchy series, brilliant series, about, I think it's called something different in America, by the way. I think from YouTube it is. But anyway, probably 20 years ago, 15 years ago, certainly. And even in that, David Starkey referred to Margaret Beaufort in the episodes that explored Henry VII's reign as the mother-in-law from hell. And you can kind of see why. You know, she decks herself out in the same kit as the Queen. She signs herself Margaret R. Queens would sign R. Elizabeth, our Queen does today, Elizabeth R. Elizabeth Regina. Elizabeth the Queen is basically the translation from the Latin. And Margaret, technically Margaret R stands for Margaret Richmond because she's the Countess of Richmond. She was the wife of the Earl of Richmond, but she knows what she's doing. She's claiming sovereignty. She's claiming to be a queen in all but name. And as a result, you can see why maybe the relationship is tense. She's encroaching onto this sort of sovereign territory that should belong, in all fairness, to Elizabeth of York. And as a result, surely she's going to have a negative relationship with her daughter-in-law. However, this book is well worth a read. I just hit the screen. Nicola Tallis, quite new, it was new at the time of recording, and if you're watching this 10 years' time, it's obviously not that new, is it? But a really good biography of Margaret Beaufort, the uncrowned queen. And also, it's worth reading. I can't find my copy, which is really annoying. Otherwise, I'd be holding it up. A biography of Elizabeth of York, the first Tudor queen. It's called by Alison Weir, and both of them think that Margaret and Elizabeth would have had a much more positive relationship, as do other historians, than has perhaps been understood in more recent years, particularly than has been presented in historical fiction. So, in terms of sources for what their relationship was like, we don't actually know very much. There's only two sources that could be in any way seen to directly comment on their relationship. The first, Spanish ambassador comes to England. They're negotiating the marriage between Elizabeth of York's son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, and Catherine of Aragon. We all know who she ends up marrying, don't we? And basically, he goes back to Spain and he gives his feedback. It's like, Queen Elizabeth is beautiful, lovely, but she don't have much to say. She is oppressed. She is kept in the corner by the king's mother. And she's completely sidelined from all decision making. Okay, that suggests a pretty negative relationship. It very much ties in to that kind of David Starkey mother-in-law from hell image of Margaret Beaufort, which I talked about just a moment ago. Another source is also around the negotiation of a marriage, and it's when Henry VII is negotiating the marriage of his daughter Margaret Tudor, or Princess Margaret, to the King of Scots. She's young at this point, and he is approached by both his mother, Margaret, and his wife, Elizabeth of York, and they say that they don't want the marriage to take place yet because Margaret Tudor is too young, and the king won't spare her, i.e. he'll want to consummate the marriage straight away, and that'll be extremely damaging for the young Margaret. And of course, it's easy to assume, and I think quite correctly, that Margaret Beaufort, Margaret the Elder, is drawing upon her own experience as a child bride, and the trauma that, although she never talked about it, the trauma that would have left her with, both emotionally and physically. So here you've got Elizabeth and Margaret as co-collaborators working together to intercede for their descendants, and they're working together very effectively because they managed to get what they wanted, and the wedding was delayed by a few crucial years. That's it. Those are the two sources that really count directly. Everything else pretty much depends on how you view Margaret Beaufort as a figure. If you're quite pro-Margaret, then the rest of the available evidence you interpret relatively positively about their relationship. If you think of her as quite a sneaky, manipulative, almost sinister character, which I know a lot of people do, which I think is a real shame. I don't think it's the right interpretation at all, but many do. Then you're going to interpret Margaret's behaviour as domineering, overpowering, aggressive, and that's how you're likely to conclude that the relationship is. And I don't think we're ever going to get an answer to this. I don't think we know enough about the characters of either woman. I think we'd like to, but it's just not really there. So I guess the question is, what do I think? Because you're watching my video, although I do want to hear what you think, and I want you to tell me in the comment section as well, either on this or on Facebook or something. Well, I just want to make a few points. And the first point I would make is a point that I've seen Amy Licence make. I've not actually read Amy Licence's book on Elizabeth York, but I've seen some of her comments in interviews, and she makes the point that first and foremost, Margaret and Elizabeth wouldn't have understood their relationship, or at least the priorities in their relationship, in the way that we would now. We would think of a mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship as being about chemistry, getting on, what they've got to talk about, what they've got to discuss, shared interest. Those aren't the factors that are important to Margaret and Elizabeth. They both know how important it is to get Project Tudor right. Their descendants depend on it. And if they don't get it right, it's going to cause problems for them and for Elizabeth's children, Margaret's grandchildren. They are their focus. That dynasty is their focus. So they would have been looking at each other primarily as co-collaborators for a common endeavour, and it is highly likely, it's really inconceivable for this not to be the case, that they would have appreciated what each other brought to the table, what they brought to the table dynastically, what they brought to the table in terms of the roles that they had to play, and would want each other's roles to be fully utilised in that regard. As I think about the relationship, and as you can tell, I've spent quite some time thinking about it between Margaret and Elizabeth, there's two, possibly three, theories. Are they really theories? I don't know if they're strong enough to be theories. They probably can't be evidenced enough to be theories, but thoughts I have on how I understand everything that goes on, why the three, the king, the queen, my lady, the queen, the king's mother, are in each other's company so much. And I'll just share those with you. So, first of all, we have to remember how important imagery and symbolism is in the early Tudor reign. Imagery and symbolism is important in any late medieval reign, so that's not new. But the messages that they're trying to use symbolism to communicate in this stage is, you had England divided by wars, the wars of Lancaster versus York. Henry VII comes in as the great uniter. He conquers England, he claims the throne by conquest, and he marries Elizabeth of York, uniting those warring factions and bringing peace to the realm. And if you think, as they were always together, as they so often were in the early years, the king, the queen, and my lady, the king's mother, that symbolism is played out physically, almost in theatre, as the three of them are together on big spectacle occasions. So you've got Elizabeth of York, the Queen, the representative of the House of York. You've got Margaret, who somewhat spuriously is positioned as the representative of the House of Lancaster. Margaret was the descendant of John of Gaunt, who was Duke of Lancaster, but not through the Lancastrian marriage. But through a subsequent marriage. But nonetheless, after the core Lancastrian line is obliterated, Margaret is probably, to paraphrase a term that was used about Henry VII, the closest thing that Lancaster had to royalty. So she fulfills that role, and then, of course, right at the front of it, Henry VII, the person that brings those two factions together. So I think there's an element of deliberate symbolism in Margaret's presence in the early part of the reign that Elizabeth would have understood. The other point, which is really a sort of connected point to that, is it was very important that Margaret was positioned as a person of excessive royal splendour. Henry VII did not want people to remember that his origins were quite spurious. If Margaret had just been a countess in the crowd at all these occasions, it would remind people that actually Henry himself was the son of an obscure Welsh earl who, frankly, was lucky to be legitimated, let alone brought into the upper reaches of the nobility. Margaret had to be this great regal figure. She had to be someone that lived in splendour and exhibited herself as this great quasi-queen that decked herself out in a very similar way to the actual queen. Because, frankly, if Margaret wasn't majestic, if Margaret wasn't royal, how could Henry be any of those things? And a similar technique, albeit to probably less of an extreme, was used with Cecily Neville, the mother of Edward IV, who was always described as the wife of Richard, Duke of York, who was the true King of England. So she was given, in a sense, Queen Mother status as well, despite not being a crowned queen, because it was necessary to validate the line that was occupying the throne, the dynasty that was now on the throne. None of that means Margaret didn't enjoy it. I think I'm a big Margaret Beaufort fan. I think she's been terribly misrepresented recently in popular history, historical fiction, really. But even I would accept she seems to revel in it. She seems to enjoy the limelight. She seems to enjoy her regalness. I mean, the whole signing Margaret R thing is probably a touch she didn't need to introduce, and she's clearly making a point about how she sees herself. So she enjoyed it. She played the part magnificently, but I think it was a part that needed to be played, and Elizabeth would have understood that. My final thought And I think this is going to be something that aggravates big Elizabeth of York fans. I don't mean it disrespectfully, I accept I'm as likely to be wrong about this as I am to be right. But I think we have to accept the possibility that Elizabeth of York was a limited figure in terms of her own capacity to be a great royal mistress of a household and indeed of the kingdom. She certainly, well, I say certainly, I think it's highly likely that having seen the role her mother played as Queen Consort in state affairs and the problems that caused, probably consciously knew she wanted to play a different role. Many historians, and I agree with this analysis, think that one of the reasons it all went wrong in the last days of York was because of the Woodvilles. It was their clear intent to grab control of the kingdom after the death of Edward IV that probably led Richard III, as he became, Richard of Gloucester, to act as decisively, as quickly, and as ruthlessly as he did to seize control of them. So, in one sense, maybe even Elizabeth of York, if she had any kind of shared understanding of that, we just don't know. I mean, she would have been a very different vantage point, so it's impossible to know whether she did. She probably didn't. But it's possible that she recognised the role very aggressive queenship played even in the destructive of her own brothers and her own house. And I don't say any of that to take away the blame from Richard III, because he was the man that did the deed and did away with the princes. And people who've seen other of my videos will know I'm certainly no Regardian. But nonetheless, I think it's possible that Elizabeth York wanted to take a very different style deliberately of queenship to her mother. And it's also possible that Margaret had to involve herself more than even she might have liked, because Elizabeth was clearly a good mother, clearly close to her children, possibly taught them to write, but wasn't a great organiser or manager. I mean, Margaret's role in domestic affairs is quite extreme. It might be because Margaret's overcompensating. She didn't get to do any of it with her own son. She didn't have any other children. So maybe she's overcompensating. But maybe, just maybe, Elizabeth of York isn't quite up to that task of a female lead within the court, and Margaret needs to do more than she might otherwise. I think the fact that Margaret doesn't actually spend the entirety of Henry VII's reign as a big figure at court. She does spend much more time away in the later years, and she plays her own important role in the Midlands and in the North. But she does vacate to a very large extent the court, which might suggest she feels she's got the stuff up to speed and could leave it. But it might suggest she did have other interests, and we know she was interested in her academic institutions and her learning and her religion, as well as being a great property magnate in her own right. So I think it's possible that she took on a bigger role to help Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was broadly appreciative of, probably at times grew a little frustrated of in the early parts, and vacated it later in the reign. Anyway, those are just my thoughts on the relationship between the two. I have been, I think, fairly honest about the fact some of them are just thoughts. I wouldn't want to suggest they were evidenced theories. I'd love to know what you think. Please tell me either in the comment section on the video or maybe on Facebook or Twitter. It's hard to have a proper discussion on Twitter though, isn't it? Tell me what you think and we can discuss. But thank you for listening. It's been quite a long video, so I appreciate your attention. Thank you.